So here we go. I'll reveal my face briefly for the national, unbelievably large audience for History 383. Our first walk through the origins of human conflict. We're going to take a look at some early images and come to raise some possibilities for whether human beings are inherently prone to conflict or whether it's something we have learned late in our history. Let's see. Here's our first stop. To the best of my ability to discover, I believe these are the oldest known weapons, wooden weapons used by human beings. The Schoninger spears found in Germany, dating back at least 300,000 years, according to academic scientific evidence. Human beings took their modern form, Homo sapiens, I believe around 400,000 years ago. So these spears would be very, very far back in our history. Is that evidence that we are prone to conflict? Not really. We don't know exactly what they were used for. We know human beings were fashioning weapons based on this very early on, but we don't know exactly what they were being used for. Maybe for hunting purposes, certainly. We can't be expected not to feed ourselves. Philip? Yeah, it happened to be, was a little cache of spears, several of them together, and in fact nowadays they're viewable in a museum. But they were covered over by kind of a wet mud that prevented oxygen from getting to the wood, and it stopped the process of decay. So they're now housed in saline solution to keep them from beginning the process of decay. But about 300,000 years ago, we know human beings, Homo sapiens, modern humans, were fashioning. I mean, they're not that great of spears, but they appear to be at least sharp on one end and long enough to poke something at 3 to 5 feet distance. We don't know whether they were being used on other humans. Let's go through some caves. The Paleolithic era. I've written up on the board the Neolithic era as one of our major destinations. Paleolithic simply means the old Stone Age. Paleo is old and lithic is stone, the old Stone Age. These are some paintings, some artworks from a cave system in Chauvet, France, southern France, dating to about 32,000 to 30,000 years ago. What do you think? These are some of the earliest pictures our ancestors ever recorded. So if you go with the scientific version of human origins, we existed in our modern form for quite some time before we began doing representational art, or maybe it just didn't survive, but we do have some older things from the Neanderthals. These, I believe, are still viewed as human drawings. It has recently been discovered that an offshoot, another branch of the hominid line that went extinct about 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals, did make cave art, but they weren't this advanced, I don't think. The Neanderthal art I've seen tends to be hand outlines. Yeah, the Australian Aborigines do that too. They put some pigment powder in the mouth, and they put their hands up against the rock, and they spit the paint over the hand, and they leave the outline of the hand there. So some of those have been dated to, I believe, 60 to 70,000 years ago, and were done by the Neanderthals. So that was kind of a shocking discovery, the idea that the Neanderthals, not humans, were doing that sort of thing, that kind of representational art. But they were not drawing this type of advanced stuff. No human figures yet, but a lot of interest in game animals, which stands to reason. They were surviving by hunting and gathering, going out and trying to, with those types of old spears, trying to bring down bison and other types of game animals. And here you even have, let me see if I can activate a space-age laser pointer, a rhinoceros. You don't see too many rhinoceroses in southern France nowadays, but 32,000 years ago, apparently, whoever did this artwork was out there mixing it up with rhinoceri. Is that the correct plural? A little bit farther back in that cave, bison, I believe. So still no human figures, but more likely than not, they're interested in these animals because that's their source of food, source of leather, other types of products. Maybe they're trying to gain some magical power in the upcoming hunt. Hard to say. This is another cave system. These are modern humans. These are Homo sapiens doing the artwork 17,000 years ago in Lascaaux, France. And still no human figures are being drawn. It's mostly animals. So let's travel a little bit farther back in this cave system. What do you think of this one? Well, that's an interesting image for the first time. There may be some older images out there, but I'm not aware of them. This is one of the oldest that depicts the bow and arrow. What do you think? Does that provide evidence for human conflict from an early period? No. This is still human versus animal. This is just making a living. It's clear human beings have used weapons for a long, long time, but here still, about 17,000 years ago, the weapons are pointed at animals. I don't know what species of deer, but some European ancient species of deer. I put this one up here because it's very intriguing. I don't know what happened here, but this is from the same cave system. You have a human figure, which is rare enough 17,000 years ago, and it appears to be surrendering, having been defeated perhaps by the bison. Maybe it was gored, maybe it was injured in the hunt. I don't know. Maybe it's a memorialization of some type. Now this I didn't know about until just a year or two ago. It's hard to find. You guys can come up with your own conclusions about how this fits in with mankind as inherently prone to conflict or a late comer to it, but it's rather hard to find really, really early evidence of human conflict, interhuman conflict. This is one of the exceptions I have managed to come across. This is 10,000 years ago in Kenya. It is a mass killing. Archaeologists, I believe, within the last 4 years, found this site. About 21 humans, 21 people clustered together. And you get a better sense of what happened there 10,000 years ago. Before I leave this image, I put it up here because that is some type of blunt instrument blow to the back of the head. The skull was cracked by that blow to the head. And this is not the only victim of some type of violence. They're all clustered together in a tight little circle, about 21 people, some children. I believe maybe 6 children, 50-50 gender breakdown for the little group. So it's not a warrior party, but they were all kind of clustered together. And not sure if you can see it clearly there, but they had their hands tied together. So they were not fighting back. They had their hands tied together and they were executed. Yeah. Yeah, the positioning and I believe some of the twine may still have been present, but the positioning, legs too, the ankles too. In most cases, the hands and the ankles were tied together and they were crouched in that position. So they had been already subdued or captured and they were under control, and that was their last day. They were done for. So that is one of the earliest demonstrations of clear and unequivocal violence of humans against humans from a very early period, 10,000 years ago. And then it begins to accelerate. It becomes easier and easier farther into the future that you go to find this type of evidence. What do you think about that one? 7,000 years ago in modern-day Libya. What do you see happening here? Philip? It's very suggestive. For the first time, you have spears. Here they're facing this direction. This guy is much smaller or much more distant, I don't know, but his spear is facing towards them. So it may be a pure coincidence, maybe a happenstance of the artist's habit of drawing things, but the spears are pointed at each other. So it could possibly be a skirmish of some type 7,000 years ago. It's also kind of intriguing. We can pursue it if you want to. It's one of the earliest artworks representing a domesticated animal, a dog down here. So this figure appears to be blowing a horn of some sort, and the animal, the dog, is cooperating with the humans. How about this? Dominique is saying yes. See some conflict. Cameron is saying yes. To my mind, this is one of the first where it's pretty clear. This is a fight between human beings. 5,000 BC, 7,000 years ago, southern Africa. But now we're into the so-called Neolithic era, the new Stone Age. Once you get into this part of the argument that some people make, once you get into the new Stone Age, the Neolithic, for reasons we'll talk about in just a moment, it becomes easier to find these types of images of human beings, not only pointing their spears at each other, but really going after it. And some of them appear to even have shields. So these guys down here are clearly, they are locked in conflict with each other, with their spears crossed, and they have closed quarters, and they are after each other. These guys are throwing their spears at each other. So that's almost surely 7,000 years ago, and an instance of human conflict. And that's a coincidence. The fact that these images, evidence of interhuman conflict, become more plentiful during this period is part of an argument put forward that the Neolithic Revolution, as it's sometimes called, or you're welcome to call it the agricultural revolution. That's something that I find a little more descriptive. It's easier for me to remember, agricultural revolution. But the point in time at which human beings stopped wandering about looking for resources, things that ripened naturally in the environment, and began planting the seeds and farming. Selectively breeding the larger ears of corn, if we're talking about Central America, or barley and wheat in the Middle East. It happened several different places around the world. One of the earliest was here in the so-called Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers join towards the southern coast of Iraq, and that's where agriculture first emerged in the Old World about 10,000 years ago. Began farming. And instances, data, evidence of human conflict really becomes much more plentiful once the farming began about 10,000 to 3,000 years ago. One of the most recent, as kind of the end point of this phase of agriculture, was here in Central America. That's where we have corn. Let's see. Now, you don't need to remember this, but I thought I would toss it in just in case you want to sound smart in a conversation. It's never worked very well for me, but one of the people you can cite. If you want to make the argument that human beings didn't really launch into serious conflict with other human beings until farming, it's Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his classic work, The Social Contract. He argued that it was private property that led to conflict. And farming is kind of the beginning of that sort of thing. If you're wandering about, there are still battles over resources. There's territory that perhaps you fight with other hunter-gatherer bands about. But when you start farming, you know pretty clearly where your crop, where you have put the seeds in the ground and where you're hoping to harvest the food that's going to feed you for the upcoming year. So there's a much more intense focus on boundaries and property once you begin farming. That is the argument at any rate. Here's one of the first sedentary towns, Catal, Huyuk in modern-day Turkey. Still in the process of being excavated in some places, but it was a settled dwelling. These people were no longer hunter-gatherers, nomadic, wandering about. They were farmers, agricultural, 7,500 to about 5,700 BC. And you can see a little bit about the way they lived from their housing here. They had their fields around the settlement. They went out and raised the wheat to process into flour and bread and so forth, and that was how they lived. Each family, if you look at these dwellings, this is one house. Each family had a granary. So from your field, you would bring in your harvest, store it in your granary, and that's what you had to eat until the next harvest. Nowadays, we celebrate some people don't even pay attention to the solstices. You know, they're just astronomical curiosities. But Stonehenge was set up to mark the progress of and the coming of the solstice, the winter solstice. I mean, we celebrate Christmas just about on the winter solstice. That's why it's there, essentially. But back then, you had to keep track of the progress of the winter and ration your grain based on where you were in that calendar. You had to make it all the way through the winter with what you had in your granary. Now, if you ran out, if you really had some feasts and festivals and invited people over and gave away a bunch of stuff out of the goodness of your heart, you could then go next door and knock on the door, but there's no guarantee someone's going to help you out. So you really had to watch the calendar. And when you got to the winter solstice, when you were halfway there and you were still running on a surplus, you had more than enough, then you could really celebrate. We're doing okay. So the solstice was an important marker of how your food rations were going for the winter. Around this town and others like it, sedentary settlements, there were still hunter-gatherers out there. Let me pose a hypothetical to you. There were still hunter-gatherer bands out there pursuing the old way of just hunting game animals and finding things as they ripened. Of course, those hunter-gatherers had lean years. There were droughts, years of fires or flooding, who knows, when they had a real tough time. What do you think those hunter-gatherer groups, if they went through a hard year and were starving out there, would do if they saw this town on the horizon? Yeah, they might check it out. They might know there was some bread, some wheat, some food housed in that town. And of course, if you're depending on your granary, your grain to make it through the winter, and you know there are people out there who might want it, you've got food, starving people may want it, what would you do to protect it? You can predict the development of history, I'll bet, at this point. If you were a member of this town, what would you do? Yeah, Yeah, I've got it written on the board, don't I? That wasn't a serious challenge for you. Yeah, you build a wall around it. So that's kind of the first development, the walled cities. And there's the famous biblical city. That's why Jericho had a wall in the first place, because it was a farming community and they were looking to protect those resources from anyone who might be hungry outside the city. Jericho was one of many such walled cities. They began building defensive fortifications around the towns. Yeah. The question is, did they make walls to protect against animals, right? Yeah. It's quite possible. I'm not aware of. It's a tough question in part because it goes to the motivation of the wall builder. And the walls you're looking at, that would have to be one heck of an animal to get through a 4-foot thick stone wall. So there are enclosures. Typically, the way to deal with pests, animals who might be coming to eat, I mean, the household itself can protect against. The granary is in the back of the house walled off. That's a good protection against deer who may be searching. But typically, the enclosures were placed around the farm fields because the main threat was toward those plants growing up. Deer, crow, different types of things might come in and eat as they are there on the stalk. So I am aware of some enclosures being put up around the field itself to protect. But I have not seen any evidence, or I'm not aware of any, of going up around the town. These really heavy stone fortifications appear to be largely to protect against humans who may be coming in trying to take the resources. And there is plenty of evidence that it was humans. I mean, you've got the biblical story of Jericho. The Israelites, remember what they did? Yeah, supposedly with the help of the Lord, one, the blast of the horn took down. But the inference there is the Israelites themselves, without God's help, without that horn, were not able to get through the walls. They wanted to. They wanted to get through those walls. So, it doesn't say, I don't think, in the biblical story exactly why. Maybe it's been a while since I read it. But they wanted in. That wasn't their town. They wanted in to Jericho, and it was walled. And the walls were there to protect against humans, whether they were, the people of God or not. So about 8,000 BC, Jericho was one of the first of those walled cities, but they popped up everywhere throughout the Middle East. And the walled cities, if the wall wasn't enough to protect the resources that were inside the town sometimes got together, formed alliances, much as the Pac-12 and the Big Ten. Are you guys following that story? Yeah, the SEC is expanding in football, and now the other conferences are kind of banding together to protect their interests. But if the wall itself wasn't enough, the towns could get together with other towns and make alliances, agreements that they would share. They would band together to defend each other. And that process led to an increasingly wide alliance network and the emergence of the first recognizable civilization, the Sumerian civilization, about 4,000 years ago. It's not part of our story in military history, but significant for a number of early milestones in human history. Some of the first writing emerged in the Sumerian civilization, monumental architecture with those ziggurats. Some of the first law was promulgated. And if you read some of those early Sumerian laws, many of them are focused on agriculture and property rights, how to protect your field from intrusion from others, irrigation, water resources, that type of thing. They were very interested in protecting agriculture, the source of their food. And the Sumerians are noteworthy because they were the first to really begin participating in organized warfare. You're looking at an image of the Sumerian military, and I'm going to ask you guys to consider some aspects of that military in our first class exercise activity. Let's introduce a couple of vocabulary terms quickly here that I'm going to ask you to think about when you look at the Sumerian military. I'll go ahead and put the text up and then talk a little bit about it as you're thinking and perhaps writing. Strategy and tactics. This again dates back to Karl von Clausewitz. He was the first to make the distinction, or one of the first to make the distinction and use specifically these terms. Today, if you watch, I hate to target almost anybody on television, suffices, but if you watch CNN, talking heads on CNN or Fox News, they tend to use these two words almost interchangeably. Stir them together as if you could use one or the other for any type of context, but it's not correct. They have very specific meanings in military history, military science. Strategy is the big picture approach to warfare. Strategic thinking thinks about what targets to hit, how to pursue the war generally, whether to hit the northern frontiers or the southern frontiers, etc. For instance, in World War II, we mentioned that briefly at the start of the class, the United States made the decision, President Roosevelt made the decision, even though we had just been hit by Japan, Americans were really angry at Japan. He recognized that England was on its last legs. The UK was in desperate straits, and Europe had to be secured first. So he made the strategic decision to focus on the European theater. Even though Americans were chomping at the bit to go after Japan and the Pacific theater, that's a strategic decision. We're going to get Japan, but first we're going to secure and stabilize the European theater. So that's a strategic decision. Once he made that decision, once they had decided, for instance, to go into Sicily, different towns, beaches in Italy, then the thinking turned to tactical decisions. Tactics has to do with how specifically you're going to capture or defeat a specific target. So once they had decided they were going into Sicily as part of that strategic, they're going to focus on Europe, then the tactical decision, once they had targeted Sicily, was which beach, how to land paratroopers to complement the beach landing, that type of thing. That's tactical. Specific moves to defeat a target, a specific target. That's tactical. So I'm going to ask you in just a second to think about Sumerian military approaches to strategy and tactics. This is an image excavated by archaeologists from the town of Ur. It dates to about 2500 BC. It's the Sumerian military, and it tells a little bit of a story we can talk about in just a moment. But your exercise here, you can work together with someone if you like, or do it all by yourself, is take a look at this image and see what types of weapons are present. Think about how this army, as you see it on the screen here, might have made war. Based on what you're seeing up here, might it have influenced strategic decisions or tactical maneuvers on the battlefield? All right, let's resume. I'm going to try and write up a few things that you've observed here, and then I'll go back into the PowerPoint, which is posted already in the content section of the Blackboard website, and I'll restructure that slide to reflect what you guys see, and that's the only stuff you'll be responsible for when we get to the testing phase. But what kind of weapons do you see up here? Yes, sir. We've got swords. Cameron? We've got a chariot, and then we'll write a few up here, and then we'll talk a little bit about them. Anything else? Do we have archery? We've got something that might look like it. We've got some spears here. Do you want to put spears? These are spears kind of lodged in the front of the chariot, which I guess they can pick up and throw at people as they drive past, kind of a early road rage type of thing. So we've got a chariot, and the spears, I think spears are only present in the chariot. Okay, good point. There are some people at the top with some spears, so I'll put that aside. I put it as its own item. Yeah, that's a good idea. We'll do a javelin. And then just to help out the Sumerian military, we'll also say they've got spears. Although, God help me if anyone makes me try to identify the difference between a spear and a javelin. Anything else? Have we exhausted the weaponry of the Sumerian military? Yeah. Well, they certainly got them. We'll put them up here. They pull the chariot, yeah. Are the horses armored? It looks like they've got a little something. I can see the harness up here. It appears to be a harness. I don't know if that's armor or not. So maybe, maybe not. Well, what do you suppose the swords are made out of? Bronze, yeah. Do you know what bronze is? What? Copper and tin alloy mixed together. Earlier weapons could have been made out of either or copper or tin, but they're quite malleable. Not really great for, and the blades don't keep much of an edge. But bronze is a harder alloy. You mix the tin and the copper together, and it comes out a little bit harder. So this is the Bronze Age. What do you think of that chariot? Does that look like a drivable chariot? We have one yes, one no, one yes. It's a four-wheel chariot, and I can tell you it's not visible necessarily on this image. There was no steering wheel. And the front wheels do not move. I mean, they are in line with the back wheels. How would you turn that? Huh? Slide? You'd have to have a wide turn. I guess you would have your horses begin pulling in one direction, and gradually your chariot would move in that direction. But this is not a chariot likely that could turn on a dime. So this was not a really maneuverable chariot with four wheels. They were all fixed wheels. So maybe you could aim, if you see a distance, a target in the distance, you could shift by means of the horse power towards that target, but you're not going to run an obstacle course in this thing. So does that influence tactics? It might. How might that influence the tactics of using a chariot in a battle? Yeah, likely kind of straight line types of attacks. And you may have a little bit of evidence of that here. I'm not sure. There appear to be some individuals being trampled under the horses. So it's quite possible, just inferring from this image, that these chariots were used as kind of straight line assault. What's a good word for that? Blunt force, huh? Yeah, as kind of a battering blunt force attack to break up the infantry formations or something. Any ideas about strategy? Yeah. Okay, so you've got three lines of the military, and are these open field battles? It looks kind of like stuff that works best on open battlefield. Do you see anything here that would be good for, we know the Israelites got into Jericho with a trumpet, but these guys are not going to be able to do it with a musical instrument. Is there anything up here that suggests they are able to attack a walled fortification? Most people are shaking their head no. The Sumerians had not gotten to that level yet. So they were depending on somebody coming out into open territory with this army. So that influences strategic thinking. They didn't have the technology or the resources to invest a fortified structure. They hadn't moved on to that level yet. These are whatever battles they think about, however they think about conquering territory, it needs to involve open field battles rather than prolonged sieges. I mean, maybe they could do a prolonged siege, but there's no evidence that they've got anything to really begin with that. This is referred to as the standard of Ur. A standard, do you guys know what a standard is? Different things, you know, we have educational standards, but in warfare, a standard is oftentimes the banner or the pennant of a regiment or an army that they carry fluttering in the breeze into battle. And it was given that name because it depicts a military scene, but it's actually painted on a wooden panel. So it's a bit of a misnomer. It's not really a standard in that sense, but it's referred to, since it was given the name early on, it's now referred to as the standard of Ur. And it depicts some kind of bad things happening. I don't think we're going to make it to the Assyrians today. I'm going to package that as something else when we get back. But there are some things happening here. In fact, it tells a story kind of out of order. In our modern minds, we wouldn't have done it this way. But the Sumerians depict, well, this makes sense. This is kind of the opening phase of the battle. And I think I heard some people debating whether perhaps this tall figure up here might be someone of significance. He is either a military leader, likely as not, or the king coming out onto the battlefield to issue terms, you know, to demand obedience or taxes, whatever it might be, to let the enemy know what's going to happen if they don't. What is the word I'm looking for? If they don't accept the terms of that Sumerian civilization. And then the actual battle is depicted down here. You've got some things happening here. This is the aftermath. You have the Sumerian soldiers marching, and over here, if we blew it up, there is actually, ancient as this is, quite a bit of detail to be seen. If you look closely, here you have a kneeling figure on all fours. He is naked. He's down on his hands and knees, and this Sumerian soldier is striking him on the head. There's blood on the head. So there you have the humiliation of the defeated. Those enemies of the Sumerian civilization who did not want to pay taxes have apparently been defeated in this battle, and now the Sumerians were demonstrating what happens to such people. Typically, when we get back together, you'll see there are lots of reasons why military historians think or credit the Assyrian Empire, which came much later in the same location, credit the Assyrian Empire with inventing psychological warfare. But I would argue you've got a good example of it here. The Sumerians were demonstrating to anyone who wanted to tell the story, this is what happens if you don't pay your taxes and cooperate with the civilization. So it's a battlefield humiliation scene in which they make a point of really humiliating the enemy. Let's stop there for the day, and we will travel farther forward in time when we get back together.